Hey friends, welcome to another episode of Not Your Mama's podcast. The title of this episode is Nutrition Advice for Busy Mamas. In this episode, we are speaking with Janice, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist, a certified intuitive eating counselor, a certified diabetes care and education specialist, and a certified eating disorders specialist with a private practice in Newport Beach. Janice, I'm so excited about this episode. I think nutrition is so important for mamas. But before we dive into everything, can you give the audience a little bit more about your background and how you got started today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My background, let's see. So after doing an internship, which is what you have to do to become a dietitian at the VA, I decided to go into private practice, and in private practice really discovered that many of the people that I was working with had a lot of disordered patterns with their eating. And so that really got me more interested in eating disorders and a non-diet approach. And so that's really what I work with a lot of clients on today is, really figuring out how they can best nourish themselves and their families, and also not pass on a legacy of dieting to their children. Lots more on my website in terms of kind of background and whatnot that I don't know if we want to get into all of that right now, but that's really kind of been my passion since really kind of becoming a dietitian about 15 years ago, is just helping simplify eating and nutrition for people, that it doesn't have to be so complicated. Also really helping people to understand what their bodies to try to change it into something that our diet are encouraged to be.
Yeah. So what are some nutrition tips that you can give for busy new moms?
So, I think it depends on kind of where we're looking. So if we're thinking about like dinner, for example, and like how do we get dinner on the table if we've got toddlers at home, which I know for me, when my kids were babies and toddlers, there was really kind of like a need for attention at all times. And I wasn't able to just kind of set them down and go do, dinner prep. So I had to get pretty creative. I would put my kids when they were babies, like in a baby carrier while I did sort of the prep so that they could feel like they were connected to me, which is what they constantly wanted, was to be held. When they were toddlers, I'd get them more involved in the cooking process. So there's lots of great things that we can have in our kitchen that allow toddlers to get up closer to the counter and be part of that preparation, which also is a great way to expose kids to more fruits, vegetables, different kinds of foods, because they get curious about what we're making. And then for, like the simplicity of it all, I would love to do meals that I could sort of put them in the oven or put it in, the Instapot or whatever it was, and be able to walk away rather than having to tend to something on the stove. So I love sheet pan recipes. I love, things that you can put in, something like a slow cooker, an Instapot that would at least do part of the prep. So like at our house, we'll do a lot of like taco nights, also allows kids to build their own so that they can feel like some of that autonomy of deciding what goes on their plate, because they're deciding what goes in their taco, but the parents still got to decide what was for dinner that night. So things like that. I think it depends on kind of where the challenge is. If it's packing lunches and the lunch box comes back, full, or if it's like grumpy kids at breakfast, which, for me, my 7-year-old is still super temperamental in the morning and also very distractible. And so I'd like to let him sleep as long as possible, but then we sort of struggle to focus on eating breakfast. So just sort of knowing, where is it that we have that struggle with our own individual kids.
Yeah, I definitely have the breakfast struggle with my oldest one. He just doesn't want to eat. He doesn't enjoy food. I'm like, hey, you want to eat? He's like, no, I don't like food. And it's like, well, you need it to survive and thrive. So it is definitely a struggle. I burn out all the time. And it's like, how do I even come up with family food planning when I have, my oldest doesn't even want really anything. And the things that he does want to eat, he gets burnt out of it. Like, rice and the miso soups and the ABC chicken nuggets. And I mean, it's really challenging. What can you say to a mother that struggles with kids that are super picky and don't enjoy food?
Yeah, I think that, is a great place to explore, right? So thinking about, specifically, like if you're thinking about your child, like where did he start to show that he was not that interested in eating? Like, was it at, the breast or bottle stage? Was it at the toddler stage? Was
It
it
was the beginning. It was
the beginning?
Yeah, like he stopped taking a bottle at 6 months, only wanted my breast. And I remember when I was introducing him to food, he always turned his head away. Like he was never leaning into it. He was always turning away and getting really upset about it. Always was very upset.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh man, we have a problem. Like I just knew like my motherly instincts. I was like, oh no, we have a problem here. He is not going to be a foodie like his mommy.
Yeah, I think, looking at kids' personalities, right? Like, do we have a kid who really wants to do it himself and he doesn't want, to be, kind of fed? That could be the case, especially when we're starting foods, or, wants to give a lot of opinions about what goes on the plate and where it goes. So for a kid like that, we certainly can build in more autonomy with the eating. For other kids, we might even be interested in any, sensory preferences that they might have around foods. One of the sort of hallmarks of the way that I work with families is using the principle or the guideline developed by Ellen Satter, who's also a registered dietitian and a child feeding specialist. She has what's called now the Ellen Satter Institute, where so she's trained other dietitians and I think she's since retired, but still kind of trains other dietitians in her way. She has a number of books. And so her guideline is called the Division of Responsibility in Feeding. And so this really outlines, what's the job of the parent or caregiver and what's the job of the child when it comes to eating. And so the job of the parent or caregiver is outlined to be deciding so you're deciding what food is going to be on the table, when, so really kind of appropriate meal times based on, how often kids need to eat or, what they've been doing throughout the day, and then where. So, deciding on, we're going to sit at the table, or we're going to, not going to have distractions, or we're going to sit outside and have a picnic, right? So that's all decided by the parents. And then the child will be allowed to decide whether they're going to eat at all and how much. So for, and this can, if we haven't been doing things in this way, it can be a process to sort of introduce this kind of framework around eating to our kids. But it essentially allows kids to understand that, like, we're not going to be short order cooks. What we put on the table is what we're going to have, but that we're not going to pressure them to eat it. And we're also not going to pressure them to say, try everything. We're not going to tell them that they've had enough. We're not going to tell them they need 3 more bites. And a lot of times parents see a big difference when the pressure gets relieved from the table. Also, sitting together, because the modeling of the adult at the table who, is trying all the food and is using utensils and, is enjoying the food is great modeling behavior for a kid. And sometimes that allows them to be a little bit more curious and interested too.
Yeah, I also find it helpful is when they see other kids eating the food and they want to be like, oh, I want to try that. Like maybe hanging around like an older kid and they're actually eating like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, kind of will spark curiosity to want to try it themselves.
Sure.
I know that was one thing that's been helpful, but I really love that guideline advice because it does let the child have somewhat control over what they're doing. And they want to feel that independent behavior. They want to be able to pick and choose. So I like that it gives the adult basically the structure and the guidelines and what we're going to eat. And then it also allows the child to pick and choose and have that sense of choice.
Right. Yeah. And so meals where, things can be easily separated, like a taco night that I gave as an example earlier, are great for introducing this concept because, we could sort of set up like a taco bar where the child could choose which of those things is going to go on the plate. They could have a completely deconstructed taco if they don't like things to touch. They could end up just with a tortilla and cheese and that's it. Or they could end up with a taco all composed, the way that maybe we meant it to be, but that it all would be okay.
That's a good idea. I should start setting up like buffet styles for my son and letting him pick and choose what he wants. I really like that idea.
Yeah, it makes it fun for them.
Totally. I agree. So switching gears just a little bit, for breastfeeding moms, what are like the best food for breastfeeding mothers that they should eat if they're kind of having not as much milk as they would like? How can they increase their milk supply? And what are some foods to avoid while breastfeeding?
Yeah. So I think, we have to sort of look at the whole picture when it comes to breast milk supply. And of course, breast milk supply is all about supply and demand. And so looking at how much are we putting the baby to the breast or are we pumping? And for many mothers, pumping isn't quite as efficient as the baby to the breast. And for some mothers, they get tons of milk when they pump, right? So there's some differences there. And also, working with a lactation consultant to address the baby's latch, whether there's any other things that might be going on with the suck and swallow. So I would sort of look at all of that first. Also really important is that the mom is getting an adequate amount to eat in general, just that there is enough food. Breast milk production costs the body about an extra 500 calories on top of, wherever the intake was needed to be before pregnancy. So it's even higher than in the third trimester of pregnancy. So we really need a lot of calories, a lot of food for a breastfeeding mom to produce enough. And then also enough fluid. So, every time the mom is sitting down with a baby to nurse, there should be like a big water bottle next to her because she usually, she can't move. So that's a great time to rehydrate. And, all kinds of fluids are acceptable for hydration. So whether it's, coffees and teas, or sparkling waters or regular water or water with ice and fruit squeezed into it. So for those who struggle to get enough fluid, I really just encourage them to be curious about like, in what way am I really feeling like a draw towards water? Is it when it's ice cold? Is it when it's with a straw? Is it when it's bubbly or when it has a fruit flavor to it? To really kind of figure out how we can get more fluid in. And then, the other thing I would look at is how we're nursing. So there's been studies looking at how much more milk can be extracted when we do give some compress to the breast, either while the baby's there or while we're pumping. And for exclusively pumping moms to, think about ways that they can stimulate the letdown. So we have these two hormones that stimulate both the production and the letdown of our breast milk. So we need that letdown hormone to, let our milk flow. And so something that can help us with that is, being in a calm environment. We always, we've either experienced or heard that, if you hear a baby crying, you're in a grocery store, your milk might start coming out. Yeah. And so for some moms, if they're back at work, looking at a picture or a video of their baby while they're nursing can also help to stimulate that letdown. Warm compresses, the squeezing of the breast, like I mentioned, to just really get all that out. And then once we've really addressed all of that, then we can start to add other stuff in that may have a small effect. Because one food on its own is not going to sort of, suddenly dramatically increase supply, but things can have sort of an additive effect. So if we're doing all of these things, we may start to see an increase. And so, things like oats and oatmeal are galactagogues. Galactagogues are things that help to increase our milk supply. Many mothers will make or have, either buy or make lactation cookies that have oats in them and maybe brewer's yeast in it, flaxseed. So those are some things that can help to stimulate. And there's a product from, what's the brand called? Legendary Milk, Legend, and then dairy, like DAIRY, that has some products that I know, a lactation consultant that I've worked with before has recommended. So, you know, things that are safe for breastfeeding and that may help also to increase supply. So those are some of kind of my top tips.
Hey friends, I hope you are enjoying this week's episode of Not Your Mama's podcast. This podcast would not be possible if it wasn't for the support of you, my wonderful community. To support Your Mama's podcast, please click the support link right down below and you can donate just as little as 99 cents. Also, follow me in the Shop Like to Know It app where you can follow me with all my exclusive content, all the way from baby products I love, fashion and style, and everything in between. Now let's get back to the episode. I heard salmon was also good to eat, has a lot of like omega-3s in it, and it's like a good fatty meat. Have you heard anything about salmon?
Salmon's great. I mean, it does certainly have omega-3 fatty acids, which we do, you know, those are essential fatty acids. So we need them. We can't make them on our own. And our breast milk is a source of it's called DHA, which is one of the omega-3 fatty acids. So I don't think it would necessarily increase supply just from eating salmon, but it is a great calorie dense food. And it's a great option for breastfeeding moms if they like salmon.
And should breastfeeding moms, like, are there any type of supplements they should be taking? Or even if you're not breastfeeding and maybe just doing the bottle, or you're not even at that stage, what kind of supplements should moms be taking?
So I typically recommend to continue the prenatal that they were using during pregnancy for at least the first year.
Okay.
Because the prenatal has the 27 milligrams of iron. Well, prenatals can vary, but it should have about 27 milligrams of iron, which is the requirement for a pregnant woman. A non-pregnant woman, the requirement is 18 milligrams. And then a woman who's not menstruating is about 8 milligrams. So there's these differing amounts of iron that we need depending on what's going on in our life. And so for many women who are breastfeeding, they may not in their menstrual cycle yet. So their iron needs are lower. However, a lot of times there was a big blood loss. And so they may have actually ended their pregnancy with the need for more iron. So that can help them to regain their iron stores, especially if there's another pregnancy in the future that we want to help to reestablish the iron stores before that happens, because we know iron is such a critical nutrient during pregnancy. And the needs just increase so tremendously as well. So that prenatal is a great one to just take as that insurance policy and that way of helping to build that iron store back up. And then if the prenatal doesn't have the omega-3 fatty acids or the DHA, then I would also use a supplement of the omega-3 fatty acids. I like a brand called Nordic Naturals. I'm not like sponsored by them or anything, but they do have a postnatal omega, which has both a combination of DHA and EPA, which are the two types of fatty acids or omega-3 fatty acids we get from salmon. So that's a great option. And I know they also make a prenatal one that the cap is a little bit more slender and easier to swallow because sometimes they can be pretty big.
Oh, okay.
So those are probably the biggest ones. Unless we have a vegetarian or a vegan mom, then certainly that changes things too. And they should consult with someone to make sure that they're getting their individualized needs met. Or if they are not eating a certain food group, like somebody who's not eating dairy, we might want to supplement with calcium and vitamin D, for example. But that would sort of be dependent on any other foods that are not in their usual intake.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great advice. I never really realized iron had to do with like how you menstruate. Like if you're lacking iron, you may not be having your period as frequently, or I never knew it was iron. I know it's important to have when you're pregnant. I know the doctors always stress that, but I never really put those two together.
Yeah, your needs change depending on whether you have that monthly blood loss or not. So like when we go through menopause, eventually that's when our needs will be less because there's no more monthly blood loss. So depending on the life stage of a female, whereas males, iron needs stay the same their whole life.
So switching gears just a little bit now. So how do you help women, handle their postpartum body image and weight concerns?
Yeah, this is certainly something that's on many women's minds. And I think it's an important conversation and discussion to even have before pregnancy, if possible. Just really kind of preparing for, what's going to happen to my body while I'm pregnant, and what are my realistic expectations of my post-pregnancy body. I think the media certainly doesn't help women in this regard because, women are often, really applauded and celebrated for like, quote unquote, bouncing back, and when we think about how much a woman's body goes through in, the like period of time that they're pregnant, and even maybe before, if there was a lot of preparation, especially for women who are doing fertility treatments, there's just so much that the body is going through that, can we offer ourselves some compassion and allow that just to slowly get back to wherever our postpartum body is going to settle. And, what I often encourage, think about, or, work with my clients on, is thinking about like, what would I do to take care of myself if I wasn't doing it from the perspective that it would change my body in some way. So like, for example, with physical activity, like, would you go to that boot camp if you didn't think it was going to change your body? Or would you be going for a walk and listening to a podcast? Right. So there's just kind of thinking about like, what ways can we take care of ourselves? Because the thing that we pick is often the thing that we will continue. If the thing that we pick that actually we like is what we'll continue to do. And that's better for us than sort of picking something that we think is just going to focus on our body change. And in many ways, our bodies won't be the same. There will be things about our bodies that may not change. There might be stretch marks. There may be just things that are not going to go back
in your tummy. We're growing
exactly
children. One of those things about bounce back culture you're talking about is a lot of that bounce back culture that we see like from the celebrities. They're usually getting like tipped and, going to the plastic surgeon and, getting like tummy tucks and things like that. And it's like, oh, look at me, I bounced back. And it kind of does put this unrealistic expectation in all the women's head. Like, well, how come I didn't bounce back like that? And we do need to give ourselves grace and know that, we just grew life, and that is a blessing within itself. So I think it's to be mindful that sometimes what you see isn't really what you think it is. It's probably a surgery. There could be Photoshop done. We have to be mindful of that.
Sure. Yeah. The comparisons certainly are not helpful to our own mental well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. Social media. I mean, it's a great thing, but it can also be a curse in a way, because you just start comparing yourself to everybody and you're like, God, I wish I looked that good in pictures, but you never know what's going on the other side of the camera. Photoshop. Yeah. So believe everything.
Yeah, that could also be a good time to curate social media, to really have, if it's something that people use, to be surrounded with content that makes them feel good rather than feel lousy when they're using it. So following people who, do have more of a body acceptance framework in their content, and really not following people that leave us feeling less than at the end of the interaction.
Yeah, perfect mental health advice. So, Janice, I have 4 questions I ask all my first-time guests. And my first question to you is, who and what inspires you?
So when you first said that, the first person that popped into my head was my mom. She went back to school to become a lawyer when I was 3. And when I finally had children, and especially when I had a 3-year-old, I just couldn't even understand how she was able to work full time and go to law school at night. And so she's pretty inspirational, and she works hard and kicks butt. So
yeah, that is definitely kicking butt. Full-time mom, working full-time, going to school. I mean, where do you sleep? Like, I love that. So what is something you wished you knew when you were younger?
I wish that I had taken more time to travel when I was younger. My husband and I, we've been together a very long time. And so we both are always looking at each other like, why didn't we do these things before we had kids when it was easier? So I think worrying less and kind of spending more time doing things that are just more carefree, it would have been my advice to my younger self.
Yeah. And my third question is, what's the essential part of your daily routine?
The essential part of my daily routine. I do like to do something physically active each day, whether it's going for a walk, or sort of, even if I have a webinar to listen to for continuing education, I like to sort of take that outside. I like to do something outside each day or something to move my body each day. And it sort of looks different from day to day.
Yeah, I think moving your body and working out or being outside is so good for your mental health. And my last question is the best advice you've ever received.
That I am not sure. I don't know that it's advice that I actually absorb, but sort of like a don't worry, be happy kind of advice is something that I think I should soak up and absorb a little bit more of. I think it's easy to sort of, get into the adult parenting mindset. And especially I think when when my kids were really little, it's like you worry about, them tripping on a wire, falling down the stairs. And like, as they get older, I'm like, the worries don't actually go away. They just sort of transition into something else.
Yeah.
So, I think just taking it a little bit easier would be good advice for me.
I love that answer. I know it's not like the problems change, they just shift, or the worries, it's like, oh, like you're going to trip and fall. And then it's like, oh no, now you're driving a car, like don't crash it. It's like,
yeah. Right.
Totally changes.
Yeah.
All right, Janice, do you have any last words before we say goodbye today?
No, this has been a great conversation. Nutrition is a complex science. And I think one of the things I really love to help people do is just kind of narrow it down into ways that really are applicable and make it simple and easy for somebody who doesn't study nutrition as a career. Like, we don't all need to know all of the science, all the facts about every food. That eating should be joyful. We should be able to be flexible with our eating. And if somebody is not feeling that way, then I would certainly encourage working with a registered dietitian so that, that can feel more at ease.
Yeah, we can't do it alone. It's always good to get professional help in any area of our lives, especially when it comes to nutrition, because it's so important. And with that said, you can find Janice's link to connect to her all down below in the show notes. Don't be shy, reach out. And thank you again for listening to another episode of Not Your Mama's podcast. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Not Your Mama's podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next one.